My daughter-in-law showed up after my son passed away with a baby in her arms. She said, "This is your grandson." I paid her for 3 years until I did a DNA test. Before I walk you through the full story, I just have a small favor to ask. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and let me know in the comments. What city are you watching from? It's always amazing to see how far this audience is reaching. That day marked exactly 3 years since Tyler had been lost in that terrible car crash on I-95. I was sitting in our favorite cafe in downtown Boston, the same place where Tyler and I used to meet every Sunday for brunch. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was there with Jessica Miller and a 3-year-old boy who supposedly carried my son's blood. Jessica sat across from me, bouncing little Lucas on her knee. She looked tired that day, but then again, she always looked tired when she wanted something from me. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she was wearing that same old cardigan she'd had for months. The boy had dark hair and brown eyes, nothing like Tyler's blue eyes, and sandy hair, but grief had made me see what I wanted to see. Jessica had been Tyler's girlfriend for almost 2 years before the accident. They were serious, talking about moving in together, maybe even getting engaged. I liked her well enough back then. She was young, ambitious, working as a social media coordinator for a small marketing firm. Tyler seemed happy with her, and that was all that mattered to me. Then came that horrible night when the police showed up at my door. Tyler was gone, and my world collapsed. Jessica disappeared for weeks after the funeral. I assumed she was grieving in her own way, and I didn't want to intrude on her pain. But 2 months later, she appeared at my door with a baby in her arms and tears streaming down her face. She told me she had been pregnant when Tyler passed away, but hadn't known how to tell anyone. She had been struggling alone, trying to figure out how to raise Tyler's son without him. For 3 years, I had been writing checks. First, it had been just baby formula and diapers. Then it was daycare, clothes, medical bills. Every month, the amount had gotten bigger. Every month, Jessica had had a new emergency, a new need, a new crisis that required my immediate financial attention. And every month, I had paid because this little boy was supposed to be all I had left of Tyler. But that day felt different. That day, something in Jessica's voice had changed. She wasn't asking anymore. She was demanding. She leaned forward, her eyes fixed on mine with an intensity I hadn't seen before. The words came out measured, calculated, like she had been practicing this speech. She wanted Lucas officially recognized as Tyler's son. She wanted his name on the inheritance papers. She wanted Tyler's house in Cambridge, the one I had been keeping exactly as he left it. She wanted a share of my coffee shop business, something to secure Lucas's future. She had been patient for 3 years, she said, but now she needed guarantees for Lucas. As Tyler's only child, he deserved everything his father would have wanted him to have. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't immediately say yes. Instead, I heard myself saying something I never thought I would say to the woman I believed had given me my only grandchild. I told her I would think about it. The change in her expression was instant. The soft, vulnerable mask slipped for just a second, and I saw something else underneath, something harder, something calculating. But it was gone so fast I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. She gathered up Lucas and her purse, that same worn leather bag she had carried since the day she first showed up at my door. Before she left, she told me she hoped I would do the right thing. For Lucas, for Tyler's memory. After she was gone, I sat alone at the table, staring at the spot where Lucas had been sitting. For 3 years, I had told myself that this boy was my connection to Tyler. But that day, for the first time, I was asking myself a question that scared me. What if he wasn't? 2 days after our meeting at the cafe, I heard the doorbell ring at exactly 7 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, I found Amanda Chen and Rachel Foster standing on my front porch. They were Jessica's closest friends, two women I had met several times over the years when Jessica was dating Tyler. Amanda worked at a marketing firm downtown, always dressed in sharp business attire that made her look older than her 28 years. Rachel was a nurse at Mass General, still wearing her scrubs from what had probably been a long shift. I remembered them from Tyler's funeral, how they had stood by Jessica during the service, supporting her through what we all thought was genuine grief. They walked into my living room like they belonged there, settling themselves on my expensive Italian leather sofa without waiting for an invitation. Amanda pulled out her phone and showed me photos of Lucas from Jessica's Instagram account. "Look how much he looked like Tyler," she said, pointing to a picture of the boy at a playground. I studied the photos, trying to see what she was seeing. Yes, Lucas was a beautiful child. Yes, he had Tyler's smile in some pictures. But he also had his mother's nose, his mother's chin, his mother's everything else. Rachel leaned forward, her voice dropping to that patronizing tone people used when they thought you weren't thinking clearly. She told me how Jessica had suffered in silence for so long, how she had been Tyler's devoted girlfriend, how she had only asked for help when Lucas needed it most. They painted a picture of Jessica as a saint, a young woman who could have demanded more, but had chosen to be humble. They made it sound like I should have been grateful that she had even told me about Lucas's existence, that she could have disappeared forever, and I would never have known Tyler had a son. Then Amanda's voice got harder. She mentioned lawyers, court battles, paternity tests. She said Jessica had been more than patient, but patience had its limits. They threw around words like grandparents' rights and child support obligations like weapons designed to scare me into submission. But I had built a business from nothing. I had sat across from harder people than these two young women who thought they could intimidate me in my own home. I listened to their entire performance without saying a word, watching how they exchanged glances when they thought they had made a particularly good point. When they were finished, I stood up and walked to the front door. I held it open and told them our conversation was over. Amanda started to protest, but I cut her off. I informed them that any future communication about Lucas or financial matters should go through my attorney. After they left, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Tyler's old chair, the one I had moved from his apartment after he passed away. Something about their visit bothered me beyond the obvious manipulation. They had been too prepared, too coordinated. This hadn't been a spontaneous show of support for their friend. This had been a planned intervention, and that made me wonder what else had been planned. I had always believed in evidence over emotions, facts over feelings. It was what had made me successful in business, and it was what had kept me sane after Tyler's passing. So when doubt started creeping in about Lucas's paternity, I didn't ignore it. I acted on it. The next time Jessica brought Lucas over for one of our monthly visits, I paid attention to details I had been too grief-stricken to notice before. The way she hovered when Lucas played with Tyler's old toys. The way she quickly changed the subject when I asked about her pregnancy or Tyler's reaction to the news. The way she never had any photos of her and Tyler together, claiming she had lost them all when her phone was stolen. After they left, I called the most expensive private detective agency in Boston. I wanted to know everything about Jessica Miller, where she had lived before Lucas was born, who she had dated, where she had worked. I wanted her life dissected and examined under a microscope. While I waited for the investigation results, I did something that made my hands shake. I collected Lucas's hair from the brush in Tyler's old room, where the boy liked to play when he visited. I also retrieved Tyler's toothbrush, the one I had kept in his bathroom like a shrine. The DNA testing facility was in a sterile office building in Cambridge. The technician was professional and discreet, promising results in 5 business days. Those 5 days felt like 5 years. When the call came, I was sitting in my office above the flagship coffee shop, reviewing quarterly reports. The technician's voice was neutral, clinical. The test results showed 0% probability of a biological relationship between the samples. 0%. I hung up the phone and stared out the window at the busy street below. People rushing to work, grabbing coffee, living their normal lives while my world shifted on its axis. Lucas was not Tyler's son. He never had been. The detective's report arrived the same day. Jessica Miller, it turned out, had been living a double life. While she was Tyler's girlfriend publicly, she had been secretly married to David Chen for over a year before Tyler's passing. The marriage certificate was filed in Connecticut, deliberately far from Boston, where anyone might recognize her. Lucas was David and Jessica's son, born 3 years and 2 months ago, exactly 2 months after Tyler's passing. The timing had been perfect for Jessica's con. a grieving mother, a boyfriend who couldn't contradict her story, and a substantial inheritance at stake. But the deception went even deeper. Jessica had been planning this con for months before Tyler's accident. She had been studying my family, learning about my business, calculating how much she could potentially extract from a grieving mother. Tyler's sudden passing had simply given her the perfect opportunity to execute her plan. I sat in my office until long after the coffee shop closed, reading through every detail of the detective's report. Jessica hadn't just been Tyler's girlfriend who happened to get pregnant after he passed away. She had been a calculated predator who saw an opportunity in our family's tragedy. I sat in my office until long after the coffee shop closed, reading through every detail of the detective's report. Jessica had done this before. Not exactly the same scam, but she had approached other grieving families, other recent widows, always with a story designed to tug at heartstrings and open wallets. But she had never taken anyone for as much money as she had taken from me. 3 years of monthly payments, plus college fund contributions, plus medical expenses, plus gifts for birthdays and holidays. The total was over $200,000. The next day, I decided Jessica Miller was going to learn what happened when you try to con a woman who had built a business empire from nothing. Jessica didn't wait long to escalate after my meeting with her friends. Within a week, my phone started buzzing with notifications from Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Friends were sending me screenshots, asking if I had seen what was circulating online. Jessica had created a whole social media narrative about her relationship with Tyler. There were photos of them together at restaurants, at the beach, at family gatherings. The photos looked real at first glance, but I knew they were fake because I knew every detail of Tyler's life. He had never dated Jessica Miller. He had never even mentioned her name, but the photos were good. Professional level Photoshop work that seamlessly inserted Jessica into real photos of Tyler. She had even created fake text message conversations between them, screenshot after screenshot of loving exchanges that had never happened. The story she was telling online was compelling and heartbreaking. Tyler had been the love of her life, but he had been taken before he could meet his son. She had been struggling as a single mother, too proud to ask for help, until finally she had reached out to Tyler's mother for support. But now, she posted, Tyler's mother was having second thoughts about her own grandson. She was questioning whether Lucas was really Tyler's son, even though the resemblance was obvious to anyone with eyes. The social media posts were carefully crafted to generate maximum sympathy for Jessica and maximum outrage toward me. Comments poured in from strangers who had never met any of us, calling me heartless, selfish, a typical rich woman who cared more about money than family. My friends started calling, confused and concerned. Some believed Jessica's story. Others asked me privately what was really going on. The narrative was spreading beyond social media now, rippling through the close-knit Boston business community where everyone knew everyone. I watched it all unfold from my office, taking screenshots and forwarding everything to my attorney. Jessica was digging herself a deeper hole with every post, creating more evidence of her elaborate deception. But I had to admit it was effective. Public opinion was turning against me before I had even had a chance to tell my side of the story. Jessica had gotten ahead of the narrative, painting herself as the victim before I could expose her as the perpetrator. The irony was that she was using Tyler's memory as a weapon against me. Every fake photo, every fabricated conversation, every lie she told polluted the real memories I had of my son. She wasn't just stealing money, she was stealing the truth about Tyler's life. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had assumed that public shame would make me back down, that I would pay whatever she wanted to make this all go away quietly. She didn't understand that I had spent my entire career fighting battles that other people said I couldn't win. And she definitely didn't understand that a mother's rage was more powerful than any PR campaign. The media attention brought Jessica to my doorstep, literally. I was working from home on a quiet Thursday morning when I heard voices outside my house. When I looked out the window, I saw Jessica standing on my front lawn with Lucas in her arms, surrounded by a small crowd of neighbors and passers-by. She was crying, of course. The tears looked real, but then again, she had had plenty of practice. Lucas looked confused and frightened, clinging to his mother, while strangers took photos with their phones. Jessica's voice carried across the yard as she told anyone who would listen how heartbroken she was that Tyler's own mother would reject her grandson. She talked about how much Lucas loved his grandmother, how he asked about me constantly, how devastating it would be if I cut them out of my life forever. The performance was masterful. She had dressed Lucas in a small suit that looked expensive, but slightly worn, suggesting a mother who spent what little money she had on making her child look presentable. Her own clothes were simple and modest, nothing that would suggest she had been receiving substantial financial support for 3 years. Neighbors I had known for 15 years looked at me with suspicion when I didn't immediately come outside to comfort the crying woman and child on my lawn. Mrs. Patterson from next door actually walked over to offer Jessica a tissue and tell her how sorry she was for what I was putting her through. I stayed inside and called the police. This was harassment, and it was about to escalate into something worse if I didn't shut it down immediately. But before the police arrived, Jessica gathered up Lucas and disappeared, leaving behind a crowd of people who now saw me as the villain in this story. The incident made the local news that evening. The story was brief but damaging. Local businesswoman refuses to acknowledge grandson, leaving young mother desperate and homeless. They didn't use names, but anyone who knew me would recognize the details. My attorney called me that night. He had been monitoring the situation, and he warned me that Jessica was building a case for a public relations war that could destroy my reputation and my business. He suggested we consider settling this matter quietly, offering Jessica a lump sum in exchange for her silence. But I had seen enough. I had watched this woman manipulate my grief for 3 years, exploit my love for Tyler, and now weaponize an innocent child in her campaign of deception. I was done being the victim in her elaborate con game. I told my attorney to prepare for war, not the quiet, gentleman's agreement kind of war that business people usually fought. The loud, public, no prisoners kind of war that ended with complete victory for one side and total destruction for the other. Jessica had wanted a public battle. Now she was going to get one. Jessica's next move was predictable but effective. She filed a lawsuit in Suffolk County Family Court demanding formal recognition of Lucas as Tyler's son and requesting $8,000 per month in child support, plus Tyler's house, plus a portion of my business assets to establish a trust. Fund for Lucas's future. The lawsuit was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation dressed up in legal language. It painted me as a wealthy woman who had heartlessly abandoned her vulnerable grandson and his struggling mother. It described Jessica as a devoted single parent who had sacrificed everything for her child, asking for nothing more than basic support for Tyler's only heir. Local media picked up the story immediately. Rich businesswoman sued by poor single mother. David versus Goliath. If David were a photogenic young woman with a cute toddler, and Goliath were a successful middle-aged woman who owned multiple coffee shops. The headline in the Boston Herald read, "Coffee Queen refuses to support dead son's child." The accompanying photo showed Jessica holding Lucas outside the courthouse, both of them looking appropriately tragic and sympathetic. My business immediately felt the impact. Protesters gathered outside my flagship location in downtown Boston, carrying signs that read, "Support single mothers," and "Coffee with a conscience." Sales dropped 20% in the first week. My corporate clients started quietly distancing themselves, not wanting to be associated with a child abandonment scandal. I was forced to hire crisis management consultants, additional attorneys, and private security for my stores. The legal fees alone were costing me more per month than Jessica had been demanding in her original monthly payments. But the worst part was watching Lucas become a prop in his own mother's performance. Jessica brought him to every court appearance, every media interview, every public demonstration. The 3-year-old had no idea that his entire identity had been built on a lie, that the woman he called grandmother wasn't related to him at all. My own attorney, Michael Rodriguez, was one of the best family law specialists in Massachusetts, but even he admitted this case presented unique challenges. The public sympathy was entirely on Jessica's side. Any jury trial would be decided by people who saw a rich woman fighting a poor mother, not by the actual DNA evidence. He strongly advised me to settle out of court, offer Jessica a substantial sum, enough to make her go away quietly, and rebuild my reputation over time. It would be cheaper than continued litigation and infinitely less damaging to my business. But settle in would have meant admitting to something I didn't do. It would have meant validating Jessica's lie and rewarding her for 3 years of elaborate deception. More importantly, it would have meant that she got away with exploiting my grief and Tyler's memory for financial gain. I told Michael to fight harder. I didn't care about the cost or the public relations damage. Jessica Miller was going to face the consequences of her choices, and those consequences were going to be severe. While my legal team fought the public relations battle, my private detective continued digging into Jessica's background. What he found exceeded even my worst expectations about her character and criminal history. Jessica Miller, it turned out, was a professional con artist who specialized in targeting grieving families. Over the past 5 years, she had approached at least 4 other families with similar stories about secret relationships with their deceased relatives. In Connecticut, she had convinced an elderly couple that she had been secretly engaged to their son, who was lost in Afghanistan, walking away with $50,000 before they discovered the truth. In Rhode Island, she had posed as the pregnant girlfriend of a young man who had been lost in a motorcycle accident, collecting money for prenatal care and baby expenses until the real girlfriend came forward. Her method was always the same. She researched recent obituaries, particularly young men who had passed away suddenly. She learned everything she could about their families, their interests, their relationships. Then she appeared with a carefully crafted story designed to exploit the family's grief and guilt. But my case had been different. This time, Jessica actually had a baby to use as proof of her story. This time, she had found a target wealthy enough to support her for years instead of months. This time, she had gotten greedy and gone for the ultimate prize, permanent financial security through inheritance rights. The detective also uncovered the full extent of Jessica's family conspiracy. David Chen wasn't just her husband, he was also her business partner in several previous cons. Amanda Chen, his sister, provided social media expertise and emotional manipulation support. Rachel Foster, their friend from nursing school, contributed medical credibility when needed. They had been running these family-targeted scams for years, always careful to stay just below the threshold that would trigger serious police investigation. But my case represented their biggest score yet, and they had gotten sloppy in their confidence. The detective had photos of Jessica and David together, bank records showing shared accounts, marriage certificates, birth certificates, everything needed to prove that Lucas was their biological child and that their relationship predated Tyler's, passing by several years. Armed with this evidence, I finally had the ammunition I needed to destroy Jessica's narrative completely. But I didn't rush into court with it immediately. Instead, I sat in my office late one evening, studying every document, every photo, every piece of proof that exposed Jessica's elaborate lie. The next day, I was going to do more than just win a lawsuit. I was going to make sure that Jessica Miller never targeted another grieving family again. Jessica made her last desperate move on a Friday evening, showing up at my house unannounced and uninvited. I was reviewing the detective's final report when the doorbell rang, and I found her standing on my porch alone, without Lucas for the first time in months. She looked different that night. The carefully maintained appearance of struggling single motherhood had been replaced by something harder, more desperate. Her clothes were expensive now, designer jeans and a leather jacket that cost more than most people made in a week. The mask was finally slipping. She walked into my living room without permission and sat down like she owned the place. Her voice had lost all pretense of vulnerability. She was done playing the grieving girlfriend and devoted mother. Now, she was just a woman who wanted money and was willing to say anything to get it. She offered me a deal, $2 million cash, and she would disappear from my life forever. She would drop the lawsuit, delete all social media posts, and never contact me again. Lucas would never know that I had ever existed. But if I refused, she promised to escalate this war beyond anything I could imagine. She would go on national television, write a book about my cruelty, start a foundation for abandoned grandchildren, with my name attached to the scandal forever. She even threatened something darker. She talked about how devastating it would be if something happened to her, if the stress of fighting me became too much to bear. She hinted at suicide, at taking Lucas with her, at making sure the world knew that Tyler's heartless mother had driven them to their deaths. The threat was delivered with a smile, casual and conversational, like she was discussing the weather. But I recognized it for what it was, the final card of a desperate con artist who realized her long game was falling apart. I let her finish her entire pitch without saying a word. I wanted her to believe she still had leverage, that her threat still had power over me. But while she was talking, I was recording everything on my phone, capturing every word of her confession and her threats. When she was done, I walked to my desk and pulled out a folder containing copies of all the evidence my detective had gathered. Photos of her with David, marriage certificates, birth records, bank statements, everything that proved Lucas was not Tyler's son and that Jessica had been running a long-term con game. I placed the folder on the coffee table between us and watched her face change as she realized what she was looking at. The confidence drained away, replaced by panic and calculation as she tried to figure out how much I knew and how much danger she was really in. I told her to leave my house and never come back. I informed her that our next conversation would be in court, where I would be presenting evidence of fraud, extortion, and criminal conspiracy. She grabbed the folder and tried to take it with her, but I stopped her. Those were copies, I explained. The originals were already with my attorney and the district attorney's office. As she left, she turned back one more time and delivered a final threat. She promised that I would regret crossing her, that she had resources I didn't know about, that this war was far from over, but I could see the fear in her eyes now. Jessica Miller was finally realizing that she had picked the wrong mark this time. The courtroom in Suffolk County Family Court was packed beyond capacity. Local media had turned this into the most watched family law case in recent Boston history, and every seat was filled with reporters, curious onlookers, and people who had been following the story on social media. Jessica arrived with her legal team, a group of hungry young attorneys who had taken her case for publicity and the potential payday. She was dressed in a conservative navy suit, playing the role of the responsible single mother one last time. Lucas wasn't with her that day, thank God. Whatever was going to happen in that courtroom, that innocent child didn't need to see it. My attorney, Michael Rodriguez, stood to present our evidence with the calm confidence of a man who knew he held all the winning cards. He started with the DNA test results, presenting the scientific proof that Lucas shared no genetic material with Tyler. The lab technician who had processed the test took the stand to explain the results in terms that left no room for interpretation. 0% probability of paternal relationship, not unlikely, not improbable, but scientifically impossible. Jessica's attorney objected, claiming the DNA samples could have been contaminated or mishandled, but Michael produced the chain of custody documentation and laboratory certifications that proved the test had been conducted properly. Then came the detective's evidence, photo after photo of Jessica with David Chen, taken over the past 4 years. Their marriage certificate filed in Connecticut 3 years before Tyler's passing. Lucas's birth certificate clearly listing David Chen as the father. Bank records showing shared accounts between Jessica and David. Tax returns filed jointly as a married couple. Lease agreements for apartments they had shared together, all predating Tyler's passing by years. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Jessica Miller had never been Tyler's girlfriend. She had never carried his child. She had been perpetrating an elaborate fraud for 3 years, extracting over $200,000 from a grieving mother. But Michael wasn't finished. He presented evidence of Jessica's previous cons, the other families she had targeted, the pattern of grief exploitation that spanned multiple states in several years. When Jessica took the stand to defend herself, she fell apart under cross-examination. She couldn't explain the contradictions in her story. She couldn't account for the physical evidence of her marriage to another man. She couldn't justify the fake photos and fabricated text messages she had used to support her lies. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Williams, listened to the entire presentation with growing incredulity. When the evidence phase concluded, she didn't even recess to consider her decision. From the bench, Judge Williams delivered a scathing condemnation of Jessica's actions. She called the case one of the most egregious examples of fraud and emotional manipulation she had encountered in 20 years on the family court bench. Not only did she dismiss Jessica's lawsuit entirely, but she also ordered Jessica to pay all of my legal fees and court costs. More importantly, she referred the case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. As the courtroom emptied, Jessica sat at the defendant's table, finally understanding that her 3-year con game had not only failed, but had destroyed her life in the process. Her attorney gathered his papers and left without another word, abandoning his client now that the publicity value had shifted from positive to catastrophic. I didn't feel satisfaction or victory. I felt exhausted and hollow, like I had just finished a marathon that I never wanted to run. But I also felt something else, the first real peace I'd experienced since Tyler's passing. For 3 years, I had been living with a lie that poisoned my grief and corrupted my memories of my son. Finally, I knew the truth. The courtroom victory was just the beginning of Jessica's downfall. Within hours of Judge Williams's ruling, the story exploded across local and national media. The narrative flipped completely, from heartless businesswoman abandoning grandson to brilliant con artist exposed by determined mother. The Boston Globe ran a front-page story about Jessica's elaborate deception, complete with photos of the evidence presented in court. The headline read, "3-Year Con, How a Fake Grandmother Scam Fooled Boston Businesswoman." Television news picked up the story immediately. I was contacted by producers from 3 major networks wanting exclusive interviews about how I had uncovered the truth and fought back against Jessica's manipulation. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source. Other victims of Jessica's previous cons started coming forward, emboldened by my public victory to share their own stories of how she had exploited their grief for financial gain. A widow from Hartford contacted my attorney, describing how Jessica had convinced her that she had been secretly dating her late husband. An elderly couple from Providence shared their story about Jessica's fake pregnancy and miscarriage con. A family from Springfield revealed how Jessica had posed as their son's fiancée to collect money for a wedding that would never happen. Each new victim added another layer to the criminal case building against Jessica. What had started as a civil fraud matter was now expanding into a multi-state investigation of organized theft and conspiracy. David Chen, faced with overwhelming evidence of his participation in the conspiracy, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. He provided detailed information about their methods, their target selection process, and their financial arrangements. Amanda Chen and Rachel Foster were arrested at their respective workplaces, charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and accessory to theft. The carefully constructed support network that had made Jessica's cons possible was crumbling as each member tried to save themselves by providing evidence against the others. Jessica's social media accounts, once filled with sympathetic comments from strangers defending her against my alleged cruelty, were now flooded with angry messages from people who felt manipulated by her lies. The same photos and posts that had generated sympathy for her just weeks ago now served as evidence of her calculated deception. My own business, which had suffered significant damage during the public relations battle, began to recover as the true story spread. Customers who had boycotted my coffee shops started returning, often with apologies for believing Jessica's version of events. But the most important development wasn't about money or reputation. It was about Lucas, the innocent child caught in the middle of his mother's criminal enterprise. Child Protective Services removed Lucas from Jessica's custody, pending the outcome of her criminal trial. He was placed with David's parents, good people who had no knowledge of their son and daughter-in-law's criminal activities. I thought about Lucas often, wondering how he would process the truth when he was old enough to understand it. He would learn that the grandmother he had visited for 3 years wasn't actually his grandmother, that his entire early childhood had been built on an elaborate lie designed to steal money from a grieving woman. But at least he would grow up with people who loved him for who he really was, not as a prop in someone else's con game. As the bailiff led Jessica away in handcuffs, she turned back one last time to look at me. There was no remorse in her expression, no acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. Even now, even facing 8 years in prison, she looked angry that her plan hadn't worked. But I wasn't looking at her anymore. I was thinking about Tyler, about the real memories I had of him, the ones Jessica could never touch or corrupt. For the first time since his passing, I could think about my son without feeling the weight of Jessica's lies. I could remember him as he really was, not as a character in someone else's elaborate fiction. That freedom, more than any legal victory or financial compensation, was what justice looked like for me. The media attention eventually faded, as it always did. Jessica Miller became another forgotten criminal, serving her time in federal prison while the world moved on to new scandals and outrageous stories. My business recovered completely, stronger than it was before the scandal. The publicity, while initially damaging, ultimately demonstrated the lengths I had been willing to go to uncover the truth, a quality that many customers found admirable in a business owner. But mostly I thought about Tyler, not the fictional Tyler that Jessica had created in her elaborate lies, but the real young man who had lived for 26 years and filled those years with more joy and accomplishment than many people managed in twice as long. I could finally grieve for my son properly without the weight of deception clouding my memories. I could remember him clearly now, honestly, without wondering which parts of his life Jessica might have stolen or corrupted. That clarity, that freedom to mourn without manipulation, was worth more than any money Jessica Miller could have stolen from me. In the end, she had taken 3 years of my life and over $200,000. But she had given me something too, the knowledge that I was strong enough to fight for the truth, even when that fight cost everything. And sometimes, in a world full of beautiful lies, the painful truth was the only thing worth having.